Okay, welcome to panel 7, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I will be chairing this panel called The Undoing of Bodies and Selves on the Vulnerability of Change. The panelists today are Elena Rubini from the Università del Piemonte Orientale in Italy. Elena is a PhD student in interdisciplinary doctoral program in global health, humanitarian aid, and disaster medicine. Wow, can I just say wow? It's a big one. She's based in Italy, as I said, and you're currently working on comparative literature establishing differences and similarities between memoirs depicting sexual violence in conflicts and other contexts. Our second panelist today is Andrea Moyesse. Hopefully I pronounced your surname correctly. And you're a master's student in British Cultural Studies program at the University of Bucharest in Romania. Her BA thesis analyzed the experience of personalization in Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse from a perspective blending phenomenology within psychiatry. So I would like to ask Elena to start, if it's okay. Elena's paper is called On Vulnerability, Victims and Conviction, a comparison between Emerald Fennell's Promising Young Woman and Alice Sebald's Lucky. You both have 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you for having me and for the introduction, and also for organizing this amazing conference. In this paper, I will shed light on the paradox connected to vulnerability in Western society, focusing on the movie Promising Young Woman by Emerald Fennell, on Alice Sebald Lucky, and in the recent developments in the court case regarding the exoneration of Anthony Broadwater, wrongly accused by Sebald of being the man who raped her in 1981. And to better understand how vulnerability is connected to Promising Young Woman and Lucky, let's focus on how philosopher Erin Cunliffe Gilson describes it in capitalist Western society. And I quote, "Vulnerability is equated with susceptibility to harm. It is considered a condition of weakness, dependency, passivity, incapacitation, incapability, and powerlessness." End of quote. And this is generally speaking. For what concerns trials connected to rape accusations, on the other hand, vulnerability turns from a condition to be avoided at all costs to the conditio sine qua non for victims' credibility. And I quote again from Gilson, "The conventional concept of victimization comprises a set of norms that operate as criteria delimiting who will be socially recognized as a victim and who will not be. These norms require victims to fit a particular profile to count, that is, to be convincing to those who would judge the validity of their claims, namely demonstrating significant suffering, distress, and humiliation, and appearing visibly disrupt while simultaneously being deferential, proper, and poised. One must be vulnerable in culturally appropriate ways." End of quote. And this creates a paradox. On the one hand, people are victim blamed for having been assaulted because they couldn't protect themselves. That is, they lack agency because they are vulnerable and passive. On the other hand, appearing as an autonomous subject is something that might lessen the likelihood for that person to be believed and for their perpetrator to be convicted. In Promising Young Woman and Lucky, rape scripts are one key element, in particular their divergence or congruence from stereotypes. Let's start with Promising Young Woman. Not only the narration diverges from traditional rape scripts, but also from traditional rape and revenge movies. The ancestor of this movie genre is Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring. And two of the most famous examples of movies that take from this tradition and add a slasher element to it are Last House on the Left by Wes Craven and I Spit on Your Grave by Meir Zarki. And the key features of these movies are the fact that revenge is perpetrated either by the woman's family if she was murdered after the rape or by the woman herself. The weapons are usually phallic looking, as you can see in these two pictures, and the woman moves from a state of vulnerability into an androgynous state, as Mircolino pointed out during his paper in the 2021 Complete Conference. In Promising Young Woman, Cassandra is a 30-year-old woman avenging her best friend Nina Fisher, who got her drink spiked at a college party and was raped by a man called Al Monroe while other people were watching. Nina reported the rape and started unsuccessfully a trial against the rapist, who was found not guilty, and she subsequently dropped out of med school and eventually killed herself. In Promising Young Woman, we don't see vulnerability as a state a woman abandons after being sexually assaulted. On the contrary, Cassie uses vulnerability as a tool for revenge. And since the first sequence, she presents herself as a drunk woman alone in clubs and bars. And when a nice guy pretends to try and help her and brings her home, she goes to the edge, and when he's about to rape her, she makes it clear that she's sober and addresses the man's misbehavior. After meeting Ryan, a former colleague of hers at med school at the cafe she works in, she becomes aware that Al Monroe, the rapist of her friend Nina, is back in town and is now an acclaimed anesthesiologist, and so she plans for a 5-act revenge. The first 2 parts of this revenge are against 2 women. The first one is Madison McPhee, a former friend of Cassie and Nina, that heavily victim blames her, saying that it was her attitude and her reputation that provoked her rape. Then she goes to Dean Elizabeth Walker, that affirms that the circumstances of Nina's rape were a he said, she said situation, and comments, and I quote, "What would you have me do? Ruin a young man's life every time we get an accusation like this? I have to give him the benefit of the doubt," end of quote. Moreover, the title of the movie, Promising Young Woman, is a sort of ironic opposition to the idea of the promising young man whose life was destroyed by accusations of rape. And as Rachel Thompson points out in her essay, Rough, and I quote, "This prioritization of perpetrators' careers comes at the expense of survivors who exist in a culture where speaking up about sexual violence will undoubtedly be met with victim blaming, expressions of doubts, and attempts to undermine, invalidate, and minimize their pain and trauma," end of quote. And then Cassie wants to take revenge on Al Monroe's former lawyer. However, he truly repents, and so she forgives him. She then goes to Al Monroe's bachelor party, dressed, as you saw in this picture, in a nurse costume and presenting as a sex worker. And there she spikes a bottle of vodka, makes the man at the party drink it, and then moves into a separate room with Al Monroe and cuffs him to the bed and asks him to describe what he did to her friend Nina. At this point, Al Monroe, that you can see in this picture, doesn't take any responsibility for his actions. Instead, he says, "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong." And at this point, Cassie wants to carve on his abdomen Nina's name with a scalpel. However, he frees one of his hands and suffocates her with a pillow. And in the movie, this is a 2 minutes long scene to stress the fact that he actually aimed to kill her. Moreover, suffocation is one of the most common causes of death in feminicide. And even in this case, he keeps on saying to Cassie, "This is your fucking fault." And an important thing to note is that while other women tend to victim blame Nina, men tend to back other men. And this happens too in Promising Young Woman when Joe, Al's best friend, discovers that he killed Cassie. And he tries to make all sorts of excuses for his behavior, saying, "This is not your fault. It was an accident and you did nothing wrong." And Al Monroe isn't concerned about the fact that he killed somebody, but instead asks questions only connected to his own future, like, am I going to jail? Or what about my wedding and my job? And the two then burn Cassie's corpse in order to destroy all evidence. However, before going to Al Monroe's bachelor party, Cassie sent to Al Monroe's former lawyer a letter with explaining where she was going, and also the telephone containing the video of Nina's rape. So thanks to her wit, Al Monroe is finally arrested. And so while at the end of the movie, Cassandra's being defenseless may seem like the reason for her defeat, in reality, this constitutes the only means to succeed in having her voice heard and obtaining justice. In the end, 2 women had to die, one by suicide, the other murdered, in order for the police to incriminate Al Monroe. This also highlights how often women are believed by authorities only when it's straight for them to be protected. Before moving on, let's pause for one moment on male characters in Promising Young Woman. Toxic masculinity here is connected with those who appear at first sight as nice guys, and the movie forces us to reflect on how being a nice guy is often a mask and a protection against responsibility. In particular, the movie stresses how being a woman who was raped by a white, middle-class, well-known and presumably well-off man made it difficult for the victim to be believed, and how eventually her perpetrator was found not guilty. So, while in Promising Young Woman, Nina was raped at a party after being drugged by a white and popular man, in her memoir, Lucky, Sebald describes a completely different scenario. In fact, in her memoir, the author describes being raped by a stranger, identified by her as a black man, in an alleyway at night, while she was wearing oversized clothes. Moreover, she was severely beaten, was forced to lay on broken glasses, and experienced perineal and vaginal lacerations that could cause severe bleeding. Sebald, at the time of the rape, was a white, middle-class, 18-year-old virgin studying at Syracuse University. She did not have any drugs or alcohol in her system. During the forensic gynecological examination, semen was found, as well as a hair coming from a different individual than her. So in this sense, Sebald's assault respects the stereotypical rape script, sexual violence with aggression of an innocent girl by a stranger. Add to that racism and the myth of the black rapist corrupting white women's virtue, and you have the complete picture. So, in Alice Sebald's case, the elements that stood out were vulnerability and adherence to rape scripts, in particular connected to her virginity, as well as a racial bias on the part of Sebald and the inner racism of the American juridical system in the 1980s. Concerning her virginity, which she's aware might be beneficial for her, when she's asked to testify before the grand jury, this happens, and I quote, she says, "I was aware my loss that night was my gain today. Having been a virgin made me look good, made the crime appear worse. I cried a little then. The reality was that these two made me look good," end of quote. And despite her rape respecting the stereotyped rape script, she faced a higher degree of victim blaming, which also had an impact on her developing PTSD and later on an addiction to alcohol and drugs. So in order to counterbalance this victim blaming, Sebald says at this point, and I quote, "So I told them I was stupid, that I shouldn't have walked through the park. And I was so good, so willing to accept blame that I hoped to be judged innocent by them." And now let's move on to the question of race and its implications in Sebald's case. From a historical perspective, and I quote from Brenner, "The likelihood that an alleged rape perpetrator would be convicted and severely punished was closely linked to the races of the parties involved. Men of color who were accused and convicted of rape were far more likely to receive the harshest punishment, a reality reflected in the extralegal context by the lynch mob," end of quote. The first mention of the race of Sybil's rapist is not found when she describes in graphic detail a rape, but later on, when the boyfriend of one of her friends who is Black asks her if her rapist was Black. Racism pervades her father's reaction to seeing some Black men strolling down the street in Philadelphia, as well as the words and actions of a police officer. Sybil seems to condemn that. However, when she enumerates her advantages compared to her rapist, she states, and I quote, "He was Black and I was white," with Black written with a lowercase initial, conscious that she would be more easily believed than if her rapist were a white man. When describing the trial, out of rage due to the fact that most of the questions of Broadwater's lawyer aimed to prove that as a white woman, it would have been very easy for her to misidentify a Black man, as it happened during the lineup that you can see in this picture. She says, and I quote, "I was guilty for the race of my rapist, guilty for the lack of representation of them in the legal profession in the city of Syracuse, guilty that he was the only Black man in the room," end of quote. This is not to say that Sybil lied about her rape. However, some of the circumstances after the sexual assault, for example, connected to eyewitness misidentification, are drenched in racial bias. Another element is connected to forensic identification, because the trial occurred in 1982 when DNA wasn't used for the purpose of identifying individuals in criminal cases. Instead, microscopic analysis was used, and nowadays it is no longer used because it's easily biased by the examiner's subjectivity. And it was for this reason that in December 2021, Anthony Broadwater was exonerated for the rape of Sybil. Wrapping up and summarizing our findings, the author had to show herself in her most vulnerable state in order to win her case, directly affecting Broadwater's sentence, because what emerged was an account adhering to stereotypes surrounding rape, as well as to the myth of the Black rapist. This last one connected to eyewitness and forensic misidentification. Moreover, during the trial, it seemed like Sybil's victimization could be confirmed only if the defendant was condemned. At the same time, in the present moment, Broadwater's victimization is often matched with disregard connected to Sybil being a victim of rape, making their vulnerabilities mutually exclusive. These elements, highlighted in Promising Young Woman and Lucky, help us disclosing an overt fallacy, namely our expectation for people who have been victims of crime to embody all the features of the ideal victim in order for us to believe them. This is true in the case of fictional Nina Fisher's and of Alice Sybill's rapes, but is equally true for Anthony Broadwater, who spent 20 years in jail for a crime he did not commit. Vulnerability expectations connected to the victim are interrelated to stereotypes surrounding perpetrators and alleged ones. One should not be encouraged to die physically or mentally in order for us to bother to listen to their sorrow and pain. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you. Okay, our second panelist, Andrea, is presenting, where is it? Sorry, a paper called Women's Story Are Often Sad Stories, Anticipating Grief in Sigrid Nunez's What Are You Going Through?
Hello, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me in your conference. I will be discussing Sigrid Nunez's novel, What Are You Going Through, which was published in 2020 and was framed by the author as a narrative extension of the same narratorial voice of her critically acclaimed 2018 novel, The Friend. However, while The Friend was concerned with traditional grieving in absence and grieving post-death, as the narrator becomes burdened with the Great Dane that belonged to a racer friend who had committed suicide, and it tells the story of her own grieving as amplified by the dog's grief. What they're going through moves ahead of the death event and narrates mourning in its anticipatory and socialized dimension. In this novel, an unnamed woman of a certain age assists a terminally ill friend into ending her life, and this narrative is framed by various stories and conversations that the narrator has with women transitioning into old age. The overarching interest of the novel is to engage with what Simone Weil, the philosopher who inspired the title of the novel, called the power of attention. Illness, aging, mourning, and affliction are topics irremediably linked with the event of the death of the other, and the act of witnessing these processes inherently questions appropriate paradigms of acknowledging suffering. To quote Simone Weil, the love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say to him, "What are you going through?" My presentation ties in with the parameters of anticipatory, socialized, and gender dimension of mourning and the empathic responsibility entailed by this paradigm. I will be using Amica Terini-Prodromu's theorization of memoirs of textured recovery, which dismiss prescriptive scenarios of mourning, rendering it an either pathologically finite, following Freud's mourning and melancholia, or as an endless process, according to new wave theories. The novel concretizes a space of in-betweenness that allows the countering of clinical guides to healing, and its fictional dimension only enriches the potentialities of literature in expressing a pain which, while deemed indefinable by means of language, finds a fruitful source in experimental techniques that coalesce various themes into the complex web of human truth. In this way, Nana's novel becomes capable of integrating various realities such as cliched reactions and behaviors shaped by medical discourses which do not accommodate the needs of the patient, dynamics of infelicitous motherhood, collective female suffering and power relations, as well as humor in the face of crisis. What we're going through innovates the genre of pathographies and literature of grief by, on the one hand, couching meaning in fictionality, which leads to a varied collection of interests and musings which materialize the complicated and ambiguous trajectory of human experience during moments of crisis that are presented in both the personal and collective dimensions. And on the other hand, the novel refocuses the narrative standpoint on the witness instead of the patient. While the narrator's friend imparts some limited insights into the insufficiencies of societal coping with the diseased, such as her contempt for positive narratives and euphemisms, it is always the narrator's interpretation which moves the novel forward and seeks to incorporate the personal into the global. Halfway through the novel, the two women meet in the bar of the youth, a nostalgic place where they used to have drinks as students in university, and the friend confesses that she intends to forego cancer treatment because she wants, and I quote, "a good death, free of pain or at least not convulsing in agony, going out with boys with a little dignity, clean and dry." And quoting again from the novel, the friend declares that she will not go out in mortifying anguish. And we find the narrator's reaction when she says that she's in possession of a euthanasia drug. As the friend enlists the narrator's help in assisting her death, and the narrator is invited to accompany her on a trip to a peaceful house in the countryside, where, unbeknownst to the narrator, she would one day take the drugs. And I quote from the novel, "As I told you, her plan is not to let me know exactly when she'll be taking the pills. One day you'll wake up and it will be done," she said. "You'll know because the door to my room will be closed." As the narrator emphasizes on many occasions throughout the novel, humor has always been her friend's coping mechanism, and death too is treated with comic relief. As she says, like the coming of the Lord, you will not know the day or hour. This tragic anticipation triggered by the unawareness of the specific occurrence of death, reconstructed as an upcoming but equally ever-present event. As Therese Randall emphasizes, anticipatory grief is subject to misconceptions that enclose it as either solely related to the final event of death, thus overlooking precursory losses such as diagnosis and treatment, or as finalizing with the death of the mourned person. Witnessing is materialized as empathic in the novel, and the first person standpoint is rooted in a stance of narrative humility, which practices an acknowledgement of the multifaceted and dynamic dimensions of patient narratives, which are grasped not as, and here I quote, objects to be comprehended or mastered, but instead placing them in a conversation that engages with their ambiguous and contradictory narratives. For Vina Das, the impetus of literature is the performance of the act of acknowledgement, which is broadly defined by philosopher Stanley Cavell as a process of, I quote, recognizing the complexity of living among others where one is always performing acts of social reading and interpretation. This is akin to an ethical responsibility for the other narrativized, a choice that compels the teller to render them truthfully in writing, no matter the incongruities inherent in their truthfulness. Nanes writes in the tradition of Simone Weil and her dictum of the attentive gaze, as well as Susan Sontag's, for whom the writer of fiction is a moral agent and the emissary of sympathy. And indeed, Susan Sontag represents a major influence for Nanes, and one can recognize the concerns of her essay Illness as Metaphor in the opinions of the French, even though the pathologized metaphors used to describe cancer have become intimately familiar to patients. Reiterating Sontag's critical treatment of expressing cancer through militarized mythologies of fighting, the French shares her alienating relationship with medical positivity addressed to cancer patients. She says that this is likened to a fight between patient and disease, between good and evil, where there is the warrior's way and the quater's way. If you survive, you're a hero. If you lose, well, maybe you didn't fight hard enough. And people dismiss defeatist talk. Quite a few people try to convince me not to stop working, carry on as if all were well, and maybe then all will be well. Similarly, she stresses her categorical choice in demythologizing the Panglossian military vocabulary by not fighting the war or waiting out the final decisive blow of the illness. And I quote, people ought to be able to understand that this is my way of fighting. Cancer can't get me if I get me first. And what's the sense in waiting when I'm ready to go? Arthur Frank was one of the first to spotlight the degrees of embodiment afforded in narratives of illness, as the act of narrativizing it is always done through the wounded body of the storyteller, and this embodiment requires the ethical responsibility of the witness, whose, I quote, observation commits the body. The acute embodiment enforced by illness is inextricably rooted in the experience of pain, which for the narrator's friend represents a terrifying experience to be actively excused if at all possible. And I quote, pain was the thing that terrified her most, because in that kind of pain, you can't think straight, you're a desperate animal. Frank equally theorizes the existence of four ideal body types characterized by the methods of coping with illness, and what he calls the disciplined body aligns with encouraged scenarios of treatment which stress the importance of self-regimentation in the patient, thus transforming the bodies into defamiliarized objects to be treated. And it is this which the narrator's friend aims to resist by owning a narrative of illness that caters to intimate desire for dignity rather than to institutional and medical narratives. Sandra M. Gilbert too emphasizes that this choice reflects a cultural shift. As she says, the cultural expectation of waiting for death and knowing it would come that had historically characterized health professional, family, and patient responses to dying has been replaced in many cases by decision-making regarding when and how to end life. She discusses the creation of a mythology of modern death, which, I quote, by either staving itself or facilitating it, has enabled a ruling over the spontaneity of death through the innovation of deaths, I quote again, carefully planned, controlled, administered. The narrator also comes across prescriptive vocabularies, this time for consoling the mourning. She introduces the character of a gym trainer, a young bulky man with emotive affinities who, after discovering her affliction, that a close friend of hers is terminally ill, can only provide comfort through cliched phrases such as, I'm always here for you, is there anything I can do? I'm so sorry for what you're going through, promise you won't forget about self-care, as well as suggesting exercising to cope with stress. And through artificial, albeit well-intended acts, such as offering her an unsolicited big warm hug. Ultimately, the friend explains both vocabularies, and I quote, not that I think they all really believe what they're saying, she goes on, but they obviously believe it's what they should say. For Nana's illness and its correlating pain are biocultural, which is a concept theorized by D.B. Moise, among others, considering that pain generates the medical paradigms for distinguishing between health and affliction and settling diagnosis. Moise questions the authority of this framework over cultural, personal, and familial significance, since pain arrests, and I quote, the deepest and most personal levels of the complex cultural and biological process we call living, and it always contains at its heart the human encounter with meaning. While Moise's interest is in colonial narratives that omit and discriminate, Nana's anthologizes the biocultural proportions of pain as inherent to female experience at large. And she hints at this when her narrator states that women's stories are often sad stories. Outside of her friend's story, the narrator collects stories of female suffering. For example, a certain woman A fantasizes about a kind, companionable old dear with whom she would grow old, but who never materializes, while a very young woman B is molested by an old man she had grown to associate with a nice grandfather figure and whom she met periodically while walking her dog. She also recalls Ingeborg Bachmann's early stories, which were dismissed by critics as insipid women's lit, while around the same time Elizabeth Hardwick was asking the question, do you know a happy woman, in one of her novels. She also mentions Dora Carrington's devoted love for homosexual Lytton Strachey and her latest suicide, which was prompted by his death. And this story inspired D.H. Lawrence to claim authority over the subject and frame her as a caricature character who hates what he calls real men in his novel Women in Love. In the same way, an old neighbor's son asks the narrator to pay her visits from time to time in order to check up on her and keep her company, as the woman feels lonely and is harassed by phone scammers that she cannot help but answer. And in the end, the old woman outlives her son, who dies of a coronary. Similarly, the narrator's Airbnb host adopts a loving rescue cat as a companion in old age. And finally, the narrator produces multiple crime mysteries throughout the novel, which follow the crimes of misogynistic serial killers that seem to mirror the merry widow murderer of Hitchcock's movie Shadow of a Doubt, to whom, I quote, his female victims deserve to be slaughtered. The politics of female victimhood, suffering, as well as the double standard of aging in Zonteg's understanding, that is the shameful social pathology of women's aging as synonymous in society with the loss of youthfulness, which is a restraining convention for women, all materialize a process of female mourning that engages with patterns of discrimination and abuse. Affect becomes politicized by means of the unraveling of the power relations inherent to the scenario of female suffering, be it at the hands of terminal illness, aging, or the mere act of establishing relationships in society. Richard Rorty also underscores how descriptive literature engenders social empathy and solidarity, because it encourages an an imaginative ability to see strange people as fellow sufferers. Within the friend's narrative of illness, gendered mourning manifests itself in the lack of motherly gratification that she feels towards her daughter, whom she confesses to not loving. When the narrator's friend was faced with the reality of painful treatment, which only allowed a 50% chance of survival, she was encouraged by friends and family not to give in because she must do everything possible to fight the disease. But her own daughter's reaction was the mere statement, "It's your choice." And the narrator shares her chilling reaction to the story of this mother and daughter whom she deems an unnatural relationship. The friend's daughter has borne a grudge against her mother for the longest of time, whom she considers to have chased away her father, who was an absent presence, and her father, who was a former war soldier, emerges as a superhero, while her mother, a fighter in her own cancer war, as the militarized mythology of illness has described it, is actively despised, which begs the question of internalized misogyny as well as gender dynamics on the side of the daughter. And within this medium of interconnected patterns of gendered suffering, the narrator witness assumes the stance of anthologizer of mournings. Her empathic gaze proliferates the ethical claims to acknowledging the vulnerable not only as a unit in a collection, but as a man, and here I quote, exactly like us, who was one day stamped with a special mark by affliction. And I quote again from Weil, "For this reason it is enough that it is indispensable to know how to look at him in a certain way." And Nanes corroborates the claim to looking attentively as being enough, since her own narrator does not take action and never wishes to impede her friend from her choice. To quote from the end of the novel, when the narrator writes, "I have tried, I've put down one word after the other, knowing that every word could have been different, as my friend's life, like any other life, could have been different. I have tried love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. What does it matter if I failed?" And indeed, the concept of failure in itself is questioned, as well as the motives behind it. Not succeeding in discouraging a terminally ill patient from going through with assisted suicide would only represent a failure according to prescriptive medical discourses that prioritize fighting, even in the absence of a palpable and optimistic survivability rate, over apparent defeat. Nanes' novel casts Weil's attentive gaze as an empathic going through, which necessitates both one's attention and one's interiorization, in Derrida's terminology, an interiorization of that for which one becomes responsible. Suffering becomes more than physical pain, and mourning is readjusted as anticipatory for either personal and collective purposes. And in the end of the novel, the narrator watches the window of her friend from a bench in the street, not knowing whether she's still alive. Her testimony was never addressed to her friend because it contained a multidimensional gendered approach to writing her story. And this ambiguous, open-ended ending to the novel reminds one of Jacques Derrida's essay addressed to Roland Barthes after the latter's death, when he writes, and I quote, "These thoughts are for him, for Roland Barthes, yet they will no longer reach him, and this must be the starting point of my reflection. They can no longer reach him, reach all the way to him, assuming they ever could have while he was still living. So where do they go, to whom and for whom? Only for him and me, in you, in us." And in conclusion, what we're going through copes with mourning similarly. It does not only pose its eponymous question to its readers, that is an address call for empathetic telling, which is rooted in a singular you that begs the gaze of the I, but also the question of a plural you, and by extension an us that can partake in this interiorization of mourning. The novel casts mourning as gendered through its potential for social action, and despite the fact that it never acts upon this instinct, it both singularizes and traces the roots of common female suffering as a collective congregation that necessitates interrogation in order to provide solace. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much to both of you. Very good presentations. I will open the floor to the questions now. Does anybody have any questions for the panelists, for Elena and Andrea? I see one hand. Emma, please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for both of those papers. Those were fantastic. My question is for Elena. I'm also working on promising young women at the moment as part of my thesis. And I've worked in Alice Sebold before also. So I was frantically taking notes while you were speaking. So I've kind of 2 points maybe that come into an overarching question for you, I think. So I'll try and make it as brief as possible. So you'd mentioned the kind of, so what always strikes me about promising young women are these 2 scenes that you mentioned where Cassie threatens both Madison and the Dean as an act of revenge, and she makes them vulnerable, but she makes them vulnerable through the threat of rape. So she basically, you know, for those who haven't seen the film, she gets Madison really drunk and gets a man to take her home so that she wakes up and thinks that she's been raped. And then she threatens the Dean. She tells the Dean she's dropped her daughter off at a drunken frat party. So the threat of rape sort of exists there. And that always strikes me as really strange in the film and sort of out of place. And it sort of links to my next point, was the other part that you mentioned was the film's ending, where the cops sort of sweep in to save the day. And it always reminds me of the Carol Clover thing from when Men, Women and Chainsaws, where she calls the ending of the accused pure Pollyannaism. And I think that it always strikes me that Promising Young Women does a similar thing. So although that Cassie sort of has to share her position as hero along with the cops, and as you pointed out quite correctly, white sort of middle-class men in America are actually very rarely tried and found guilty for crimes of sexual violence, so it actually sits sort of at odds with reality. So I suppose my overarching question that ties those things together maybe is, what do you sort of make of Promising Young Women's engagement with feminist politics in that respect? So what kind of feminist politic is it actually articulating? Because there are things that stick out to me as sort of anti-feminist almost. They're sort of at odds with feminism. So I'd just be really interested to hear from you on that.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you for your question. It's very interesting. And for what concerns the scenes of threats, yes, also to me they were kind of disturbing, especially because I think in the scene when she makes Madison drunk, you don't understand right after if she was actually raped or not. You understand only later. But even in this case, you don't really understand. It's like Cassie tells her that she wasn't actually raped. And so maybe in the case that she was an unreliable narrator, this is the only proof that we have that Madison wasn't raped. So we're not that sure. Instead, in comparison to that, I found the scene with Dean Elizabeth Walker less disturbing. However, even in this sense, there is this tension. And yes, also the ending of the movie, it gives you, yes, as I said, she uses vulnerability as a tool for revenge, up to the point that she decides sort of sacrificing her life also for Nina. And however, there is this scene with the cops, but to me, what Emerald Fender tried to underline was the fact that white men, unfortunately, never end up in prison, or never, or almost never, because I didn't mention that in the presentation, but concerning the idea of perpetrators and white perpetrators, I remember the case of the Stanford rape and the fact that the title of newspapers were like former swimmer Brock Turner, and they didn't mention the fact that he was accused of rape. Instead, probably if he were black, it would have mentioned that it was an alleged rapist, at least. And so there are many issues at hand. I don't know if this answers your questions or if you have any more questions.
Well, I think it pulls out some of the key parts for sure. It's just, I don't think there's a neat answer to it at all. I also was just thinking when you were mentioning the ending there that I was reminded of the fact that I read in an interview with Emma Rhodes Fennell that actually she wanted the film to end on the scene with Cassie's body burning, and the funders said that they wouldn't have her end on that scene. They had to have a catharsis. So again, and that sort of, adds a different layer to it. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It's given me a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Can I just say, well, both of you, in my view, working on this movie in your PhD, I'm not sure, obviously Emma just said that you're working on that for your PhD thesis. I'm not sure if Elena has included this movie as part of your PhD at all, or in your case studies. I'm not sure about that, but maybe you can tell us more about it. It's something that I wouldn't be able to do. I watched the movie, and I love, obviously, maybe some of you will not, Emerald Fennell, and I think that actually watching this movie and thinking about her as an actress, as a producer, as a writer, it doesn't really surprise me how much she uses vulnerability and strength on a sort of scale, on a balance. I've seen these also, if we think about Killing Eve, if we think about also how she portrays the Duchess of Cornwall when she was young, for example. Obviously, she didn't write the scene, right? But still, she gave the character such a humanity and a strength while she was vulnerable. And for the rest of the world, that kind of character has always been the mean one. And she literally gave a new breath, I guess, to that character. So really something to think about. And yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask to Elena as well. If this, first of all, is part of your PhD thesis, or if you moved a little bit from that and decided to use this case study or not. Yeah, just a little bit more about how you're using this movie generally in your research project, and how did you sort of connected, or if you're connecting this in your PhD thesis with your second piece of work. And then I have also another question for Andrea, but I will give space to the rest of the people as well.
So I didn't include Promising Young Woman in my PhD project. However, for the purpose of this presentation, I found it very interesting to compare Promising Young Woman and Lucky, in particular concerning the idea of the perpetrator and how it was portrayed, as well as the vulnerability of the two. And also the idea of comparing something that is fictional and something that is non-fiction. And so I'm including in my PhD project Lucky as in my literary corpus of text, but not Promising Young Woman. Maybe I will make some references, for example, connected to stereotypes surrounding victims, perpetrators, and vulnerability, of course. And so I hope this answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That's a good idea. Yeah, thanks. Any more questions? Sandra.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Andrea and Elena, for those papers. They were so rich. I've got a question for Andrea. You mentioned in that the friend of the narrator uses humor as a coping mechanism. And I was just wondering if you wanted to say a bit more about that, and if there's any indication in the text of how the narrator reacts to the use of humor as a coping mechanism from the friend. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, she does use humor quite a lot, and the narrator's reaction to that, to those occurrences, is always one of her knees. But she always tries to maintain a certain distance and not judge her friend for anything that she says, for any joke that is not actually funny in the real sense. This is still a work in progress for me. It will be part of my dissertation, and I'm still researching humor and its dimensions in the novel. So I'm sorry if I can't provide more.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a really great project, if you think. Is this part of your master dissertation, Andrea?
Yes, the master's dissertation.
Good. Are you thinking about starting a PhD after that? I think we're all curious.
Yes, I am, but one step at a time.
Good, good. I actually have a question for you as well. You mentioned at some point something that I think most of us, especially those that unfortunately have had to witness maybe a loved one battling an illness. You mentioned that the militarization of the concept and how this idea of fighting an illness makes, obviously, if you beat the illness, you're going to be considered a hero, otherwise you're going to lose. And obviously this eventually has nothing to do with the people, because it's about medicine, it's not about people fighting actually. So it's just a way of seeing these illness in generally narratives, in literatures everywhere. It's been described like this in different languages, actually, in TV and whenever we talk about illnesses. However, I was actually thinking, is this something that, because I've observed this, especially in Western culture, this idea, this very capitalist idea that because we have to be the ones that run our lives from day one to the final day, we need to be our own heroes. And even when it's something that we cannot actually battle ourselves because we need doctors and drugs to do that, we actually need to fight. And if we don't, we're the losers. So I find it very much as a Western capitalist concept. I'm not sure if, you know, obviously you've researched a little bit about that, and if you found this to be generally a Western concept, or if it's present also more worldwidely, I would say.
Thank you for the question. Could you hear any noise coming from me that would impede you from hearing me? Because there's some noise in the room that I've been hoping to not happen. Could you hear me?
Sorry, I think I thought I was the one where the noise was coming from. I think maybe, I don't know, maybe try again, and maybe if the noise continues, you can just type the answers in the chat if you want. Yeah, maybe try again.
Yes, the noise is coming from my neighbors.
Of course.
Drilling. So outside, the answer in the chat, and I'm really sorry.
It's okay. If you want, you can type down any comments in the chat. Thank you. Any more questions for, yes, Emma?
Sorry, just again, just because Elena, your presentation just is related to so much of my work. And I was wondering, had you started writing on Lucky before basically what happened? And did that change sort of way you approached writing it? Because even, you know, for me, someone that worked in it a bit, it was a great shock actually when this all came out. And obviously I'm just interested to hear about how that altered the way you approached it, or if it did at all.
Yes, unfortunately, I had already started writing on Lucky, and then I discovered what happened. And so I was a bit really shocked about all these things. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the problem is also that there has been a sort of polarization
because before people were like, Siebold is a survivor of rape, and now they are concentrating on Anthony Broadwater. Well, I think that we don't have to see their vulnerability as mutually exclusive. And so I had a bit to calibrate my what I already had written about Siebold. And before I focus more on the fact that she really highlights the fact that she feels as a victim of rape. And now instead I want to add, of course, more elements connected to race. Also because of the fact that now reading it and doing a close reading of Lucky, I understood more things that I didn't notice while I first read that book. Also connected to forensic identification, for example, because I didn't know, while reading the book, I thought that they did do a DNA analysis. Instead, later on, I realized that it wasn't the case. And so I had to basically start from scratch again, my work on Siebold.
Thank you, Elena. Any more questions? Great. Thank you very much then to both of you. And Andrea, obviously, whenever the drilling finishes, if you want to add anything else or if you want any more comments, please just come back to us, okay? Thank you very much. I think that we can then close the panel now. I would like to thank both the panelists, Andrea and Elena, and obviously Sandra and Adina for putting this together. Thank you very much. And we will be back, I think, in 1 hour, actually, for the final panel of the conference today. Thank you. Bye.
Welcome back, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's 9:30 p.m. where I am right now. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the last panel of this very wonderful conference. And our first speaker today is for this panel is Francesca Passaseo. I'll briefly introduce her and let you know what the topic of her talk is going to be. Francesca is a first PhD student in Italian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She graduated from the University of Reading, UK, with a BA in English Literature and Italian in 2015 and an M.Res in Italian Studies in 2019. Her academic research is concentrated within the Italian contemporary era with interest in the Sessantotto, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, Marxist literary criticism and the works of Franca Rame. Francesca's topic is Franca Rame's Lo Stupro and Narrative Testimony as a Political Act in the Italian Sexual Violence Debate. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pooja. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, right. Okay, right. Thank you, Pooja, for chairing this panel, and thank you to Dr. Dorothy and Dr. Stroyer for putting on this conference today. So yes, the title of my presentation is Franca Rame's Lo Stupro, a narrative testimony as a political act in the Italian sexual violence debate. So before getting into my main topic, I just want to give a little map as to where my presentation will hopefully go. So I would like to make the argument that Franca Rame's monologue is exemplary of the weaponization of sexual violence testimony as a political act through the narrativization of experience. Interestingly, what I hope to unpack in this presentation is that the political potential of testimony is in this case attached to anonymization. So points to anonymous narrativization as exemplary of modeling vulnerability whilst also preserving the self from being associated only as a victim or a survivor. So prior to going into the monologue itself and its performance on television, I just want to do a little bit of a brief biography, a relevant biography as to Franca Rame's background and how this informs her creative practice. So she was born in 1929 and her family was deeply involved with theatre. She grew up on the stage performing and acting. She met her husband, the Italian playwright Dario Fo, and together they toured the bourgeois theatre circuit and also worked for the Italian state broadcaster Rai Uno. However, they were already known at this point for their politically charged theatre, and this got them fired from Rai in 1962. They carried on with political theatre, founding the Associazione Nuova Scena in 1968, which was their attempt at trying to engage the public in their brand of political theatre. And then in 1970, Franca Rame founded the organization Soccorso Rosso, where she was an activist for the rights of political prisoners. And this activism made her kind of a public enemy. There was a lot of negative press surrounding her. And then in 1973, Franca Rame was kidnapped, tortured and raped by neo-fascists in relation to her work with Soccorso Rosso. And so this was kind of a political rape that aimed to silence her activism. But this was not actually revealed until the late 1990s. Following her experience, she wrote about lo stupro, and it was then published within her collection of one-woman monologues called Tutto Casa, Letto e Chiesa, which was published in 1977. And then 10 years later, she was performing lo stupro on the stage in the meantime, but then brought it to Rai Uno in 1987 to make a comment on the sexual violence debate that was occurring at the time. Okay, so with regards her personal experience of rape, she never actually reported this to the authorities at the time, as she considered it a separate level of shame compared to the kidnapping and torture that she also underwent. Instead, she went through a moment of catharsis whilst on a train and just wrote down everything that happened to her on the back of a train ticket, in a sense, kind of bearing witness to herself instead of to the authorities. And then from this was kind of the material that made the monologue Lo Stupro, which is based on her experience of rape. But when she narrativized it, she actually said that she found this account in a newspaper and that was the inspiration. So from the off, she narrativized and anonymized her experience within the narrative. There are two reasons that I would argue kind of fall into this decision of hers to make this choice to anonymize her experience. And the first is that it constitutes a way that she can almost be vulnerable about her experience without risking her sense of self. And this is something that she alludes to in an interview where she says, I'll read the Italian, sarebbe assai più pesante per me recitare quel brano sapendo che la gente sa che è la mia storia. So it's kind of this idea that it's harder for her to speak on her own experience, whereas if she creates a distance by anonymizing it, it's easier for her to recount someone else's story instead of it being considered her own. And furthermore, I would also argue that it's almost more easier for her to be vulnerable in this state if she's demonstrating a character in that she can maintain a critical detachment from her testimony that informed the piece. Furthermore, she was also able to, by narrativizing her experience and anonymizing it, she was able to situate her experience within the collective trauma of rape and sexual violence in Italy in order to politicize her testimony. And if we turn to the structure of Lo Stupro, this also reflects her choice to situate it within the collective history of sexual violence. In that there is the monologue, which is a first-person narrative about the experience of kidnap and rape, but there is also a prologue that comes before that discusses the situation, the historical context at the time. It also interweaves contemporary news reports from wherever she was performing, and it also imagines a hypothetical conversation with patriarchal institutions such as a doctor, a lawyer, a judge, and a policeman, where they take it in turns to interview her with invasive questioning, asking her things like, were you aroused? Did you orgasm in relation to her rape? And then at the end, the monologue is then followed by what is termed a themed a terzo atto, which is where audiences were encouraged to interact with the performers after they'd seen the monologue to discuss what they had just witnessed. And so the point of, I guess, of the monologue as well is to try and demonstrate not only the experience of undergoing sexual violence and rape, but also the experience in trying to come to terms with that testimony. And this is something that she brings a lot of attention to throughout, but particularly at the end of the monologue, where she says, penso a quello che dovrei affrontare se entrassi, vedo le loro facce, I loro sorrisi, ci penso e ci ripenso, poi mi decido, torno a casa, li denuncerò domani. So in this idea, she says, I think of what I'm going to have to confront if I report what's happened to me. And, I see their faces of the policemen and their smiles. And, in the end, I'll denounce them tomorrow. So it's this idea that it demonstrates why people don't report their experiences of sexual violence often is that the idea that this testimony is linked to their identity, and that it's also very prone to manipulation by the authorities. And it can bring about negative consequences, liable to manipulation, and she has no control over her own story. So instead, this decision to narrativize the testimony and create a critical distance is this idea of historicization of testimony, I would argue. This is backed up by theory. In Bell Hooks' essay, Female Politicization of Comment, she theorizes the potential of testimony if it is theorized. So she argues for less emphasis to be placed on the identity of the speaker, suggesting that testimony should not be valorized solely by the vulnerability based on the identity of the survivor. So she argues that it's not just the telling, but the tale that's important. Hooks also talks about the need to reduce the burden of the individual regarding the narrativization of testimony. So by linking the individual experience to the collective reality, it means that Franca Rame's testimony is able to transcend the individual and speak to the collective reality. This choice, I would argue, therefore kind of limits the individual identification and instead engages audiences differently, as it invites a critical engagement instead of an emotive one by seeing Franca Rame as a victim. And this is underscored as well. This underscores her choice in that she did want to use her work to help others, as opposed to kind of asserting her own identity as a survivor of sexual violence. And this is backed up in the interview where she explains that her friend said to her, like, you must bring this to the stage. It's an important statement. It can help other people. So talking about this idea of like critical engagement and how she can use her experience to challenge audiences and engage them critically. So talking about like how does she politicize this narrative testimony? There is quite a bit of scholarship done on this already, because there are clear Brechtian influences in her monologue that kind of demonstrate this overt political message, and it is exemplary of Brechtian political theatre. So first, to turn to Brecht's in term of the Fremdungseffect, of the effect, it's this idea that creates this type of detachment that makes the subject recognizable but also unfamiliar. So it keeps the audience in this kind of liminal space where they're, assessing it as a demonstration of a character as opposed to getting like an emotional reaction. Because that, if you have the emotional reaction, it will diminish critical engagement. So people were less likely to question the societal relations that necessitated this performance. And one example of how she manages to maintain that detachment is kind of in with the prologue and the terzo atto, but also within the narrative itself. Often she'll make temporal shifts during while she's recounting the experience. So kind of dissimulating empathy by refusing a very similar representation of her rape. And therefore it centers the testimony instead of the representation of rape. Another technique that we can also observe is the use of gestus, which Brecht talks about. In feminist readings of gestus, the body is shown in relation to other bodies and how the female bodily identity is coded by social relations. And this is seen in the physicality of Rame's performance. As you can see in the still, it's just the stark staging. It's just her on a chair and her body. She does a lot of like kind of jerky body movements that are reactionary to the imagined movements by her rapists. And so because it's kind of anonymous in the stark staging, not only is it representing her experience, but it also creates that link to the wider comment on how women's bodies are treated by patriarchal institutions. So we can see through these kind of techniques, we can see how through narrativizing her testimony, she made it political. She made a political act in how she staged and narrated it in order to try and get that critical engagement from her audience. However, I would argue that testimony as a political act is not only visible in the construction and performance of a piece, she also weaponized it deliberately to make a direct comment on sexual violence legislation in 1987. As she says behind her reasoning is that in the first quote, women are almost never talk about their experiences. Violence happens every day. And I wanted to participate in this show in order to bring a direct testimony of what the kind of things that happen to women. So it's interesting because usually this idea of it goes unconfessed. Confession usually hints at the interlocutor, to use the Foucauldian paradigm, that requires the confession. And as I've already shown in the context of rape and sexual violence, these confessions are liable to manipulation. Therefore, she's bringing a testimony free of influence to people, like an unmediated testimony as such. And yeah, in the introduction to when she staged this performance, she named a member of parliament by name and referred to the piece of legislation that was under discussion. So she's directly politicizing her testimony, her experience, by contextualizing it within this moment in the Italian sexual violence debate. And so she performed this show on primetime Saturday night television at 10 p.m. There were 49% of the television viewership saw her performance. And so, she had maximum exposure. And again, the presenter of Fantastico, he also said, in this moment, I felt ashamed to be a man at reading this. So he's also kind of priming the reception that's wanted from the audience in how they engage with this piece. So as can be probably imagined, the monologue provoked a lot of public outrage following its performance. Complaints were made by the public regarding the content of her work, saying it was unsuitable for audiences. And following this, there was an absolute outpouring of media attention in the press. It's actually really interesting. I noticed when I was reading these articles again, that a lot of them that followed the performance tended to refer to news about her recent separation from her husband, which kind of suggests that already there's this kind of devaluation of her testimony that's underway, even though it's still at this point anonymized. People are trying to pick holes in her argument and her reasoning as to why she's decided to speak on this. And it was following this outrage that Rame actually acknowledged to the press that it was in fact her own story, to try and give it more validity, to try and quell the outrage that had been provoked by the performance. But when she acknowledged that it was her story, she said, I don't believe that my text will have the same effect now that they know it's mine. And for this reason, she actually stopped temporarily performing the piece. Therefore, this decision that she made demonstrates that testimony is kind of caught in this contradictory relationship, in that for it to have a political effect, it needs to transcend the individual, but it needs to be individualized for it to be accepted as valid. So it seems that there's no real way out for the politicization of, testimonies of rape. So it seems that by admitting that it was her own story, it now means that the piece has lost its political impact, because the reaction is going to be based on her identity. So whether you like her or not, you're more inclined to believe her, as opposed to taking the story at its own value. And this, again, problematizes the notion of being vulnerable regarding testimony in these rituals of discourse creation, in that people might not believe it. So just to round out, it just demonstrates that within the context of sexual violence, testimony is always contingent on the vulnerability in that process of bearing witness. And Rame demonstrated through her monologue that this is potentially damaging to survivor testimony, as discourse is too easily manipulated by the authorities, as shown in her prologue. Therefore, the individuation of testimony can have a negative impact on its political potential, as it is always destined to remain within the individual psyche, and therefore can be too easily dismissed, as we see with victim shaming, for example. So by both anonymizing her account and dramatizing it as a performance, she was actually able to voice the collective trauma of rape and theorize her experience within the historical and political context. This demonstrates a means, therefore, by which one can be vulnerable whilst preserving the self, whilst also exposing how authorities exploit the vulnerability of survivors in that context of bearing witness. So by taking the approach that she did, she was able to maximize the political potentiality of her experience while still not having to submit to the identity formation that comes when one is termed a survivor or a victim of rape. And yeah, that's kind of it. There's my bibliography. I will stop sharing, but thank you. I look forward to hearing any questions.
Thank you, Francesca. We'll take questions at the end after all the panelists have spoken. Thank you. Our next speaker is Janice Howard. Janice is interested in finding ways to engage with embodied subjectivity through her art practice. Recently, she has been exploring the image of the other we recognize as growing within us as we age, and reimagining vulnerable bodies that are slowed, disintegrating, and dying. She works mainly with the moving image, drawing on her lived experience to explore and imagine that which is not seen. Themes have focused on women, health, and representation, and she has shared her work internationally in galleries, festivals, and conferences such as the Serpentine Gallery London, Women at the Centre Film Festival Barcelona, and the Public Engagement and Performance Conferences at the Hepworth Gallery. She was shortlisted for the Birthrights Collection, the School of Midwifery, King's College London, and the Whitworth Gallery, and her work has been published as part of a live art development agency guide titled The Displaced and Privileged, Live Art in the Age of Hostility. She's a senior lecturer in fine art at Oxford Brookes University and studied undergraduate fine arts at the Ruskin School of Drawing, Oxford University, and postgraduate fine art at the Slade School of Fine Art, University College London. She's currently undertaking a PhD by publication. Janice's talk is titled Uncertain Surfaces, Running, Writing, Experimental Filmmaking, and Parkinson's. Janice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pooja. Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm not undertaking a PhD by published work because I've got it finally. So I am now fully educated.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Only just. Right, okay, I'll start. Okay. My mum was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2015, and I'd just run my first marathon. And I was trying to get fit myself after being diagnosed with an uncommon condition which increases my risk of getting breast cancer. So as an artist fascinated with thinking how I can communicate embodied experience, I decided to draw on my running practice in combination with my filmmaking practice as a way to try and represent those encounters with illness. In his chapter, Culture on the Ground, the World Perceived Through the Feet, Tim Ingold describes walking as a form of knowing. He suggests that through a literally more grounded approach to perception, through our feet, we will be, most fundamentally, in touch with our surroundings. So I decided to approach my running practice as both a potential artistic method and a form in the hope that it could enable me to reflect on my embodied experience. I decided to foreground my running as a strategy by mobilizing it in my recent work through the three methods that are indicated here on the screen, which are running filmed as a creative act of poiesis, a running approach which treads lightly, acknowledging the fluid properties of sensorial experience and drawing on different fields of thought to create unexpected results, and outrunning, linking the concepts of fear and vulnerability in the face of the unknown with the act of running. My running approach incorporated improvisation and chance and alluded to my embodied experience as continually in process. My filmmaking was a constant back and forth activity running between writing, filming, and editing. Running as a strategy became relevant as a way of moving towards a less rational, lesser known place. And since it opened up an unpredictable space for thinking, it was generative of new ideas as practice and for practice. I was drawn to Carl Lavery's suggestion in his article, A Panegyric for the Foot, that to concentrate on the foot is to offer different adventures in thought, to posit alternative possibilities for aesthetics. It refuses fixity, the weight of tradition, binary oppositions. So running provided me with a space where random thoughts would emerge, and over time, both during and outside the practice of running, form into more structured images. The form of writing that followed in the two short experimental films that I'll refer to today, which are Well-Trodden Path, The Distance Between Two Places, which I made in 2016, and A Flying Centre of Gravity, which I made in 2019, coincide with Ian Mortimer's reflection on running, that, to quote, "You think differently when running. The urgency of your movements acts like a knife, slicing your thought processes up into small segments. You think in short sentences, not paragraphs." My strategy of outrunning, on the other hand, which stems from methods of running, filming, editing, and writing, is an attempt to represent my defamiliarization with the world following my encounters with my mother's illness and the threat of my own. In A Well-Trodden Path and A Flying Centre of Gravity, themes of avoidance and attempts at equilibrium emerge as a way to visualise my efforts to come to terms with my mother's decline with Parkinson's disease, as well as the decline of my own ageing body. There's a simultaneity of meaning relating to uncertainty and doubt in the relationship between path-making, the development of a narrative trail, and the viewer's ability to capture understanding, which is embedded in these two short films. In these works, I draw on methods of storytelling, utilising techniques from autoethnography to move beyond narrative and allude to the limitations of language in relating my experience of illness. In both films, the screen is split, whereby two simultaneous filmed activities take place. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see an image shot with a camera, which was strapped to my chest as I ran along a flint field in Oxfordshire's Chiltern Hills. On the right-hand side, in A Well-Trodden Path, there's a slowed-down image of my mom walking away from the camera. And in A Flying Centre of Gravity, there is an image shot from a slowly moving train on the island of Alderney, where my mom now lives. In both films, the ambient sound of the environment is captured, including my own breathing as I run through the landscape. My running activity in both works ran in parallel to witnessing my mother living with Parkinson's disease. While her brain and her body were affected by this progressive disorder of the nervous system, I was, as Carl Lavery writes, concentrating on the foot, trying to defy gravity to outrun both the fear of illness and my mother's slow decline. According to the website Parkinson's UK, it's not known why individuals contract Parkinson's disease. It's thought to be a mix of environmental and genetic factors. And whilst it's very rare for Parkinson's to be inherited, and for the most part it will be idiopathic, for a minority of people, apparently there is a genetic link. Whilst running as a form of outrunning became, as Alicia Youngblood-Jackson writes in her paper, Thinking Without Method, my own project of refusal, it was also a way to create both a literal and metaphorical breathing space. In Running Cultures, Racing in Time and Space, John Bale writes, I run rather than walk from potential threats, hoping to place distance between the threats and myself. This emphasis on outrunning as an attempt to defy gravity extends the work of artists who foreground women's experience of illness. In Illness as Many Narratives, Arts, Medicine and Culture, Stella Balaki refers to Sam Taylor Wood's self-portrait in a single-breasted suit with hair from 2001 and observes its playfulness with gravity and its engagement with the boundary between a release from bodily limitations and the transient nature of bodies. Taylor Wood explains that the photograph is a portrait in a single-breasted suit as I had breast cancer with hair. I've still got my hair after chemo. In Phenomenology of Illness, Harvey Carell discusses the concept of bodily doubt as it relates to an experience of illness. She describes such doubt as a disturbance, throwing one into uncertainty and anxiety. And since it disrupts the normal sense of being in the world, it replaces immersion with suspension, and the familiar world is replaced with an uncanny one. Carell goes on to suggest bodily doubt as a type of anxiety, experienced as embodied doubt, whereby meaning is the doubt itself. suggesting once experienced, bodily doubt often leaves a permanent mark on the person experiencing it. It is the loss of certainty that has hitherto not been disturbed. She claims that continuity is suspended and experience becomes discontinuous. The characteristic smoothness of everyday routine is disrupted. A loss of certainty, discontinuity, and distortion of the smoothness of the everyday are also themes embedded in Anna Christoforvici's idea of fear of the other within us, relating a common reaction when encountering our own paradoxically familiar, yet unfamiliar, estranged image in others we are close to. Creating a space of communication between myself and my mother in my films focused Christoforvici's fear of the other within, as I observed my mother's physical decline due to Parkinson's disease and began fearing a future I could not see. Representing my suspension between states of anxiety and fear occurred as continuity was problematised and smoothness disrupted in the films with the use of fragmented text and seemingly disjointed images. In both of these works, I ran with the camera as a form of outrunning, an exploratory practice to feel my way through the environment of both the real and the imagined surfaces that I came into contact with. I became interested in the embodied disruptive effects of the combined methods of running, camera, image, writing, and reading, and how by adopting this strategy, I might be able to give more shape to my fear of the other within. In Walking Through Ruins, Tim Edensaw writes how travelling by foot offers a diversity of distinct experiences which defamiliarise the encounter between feet and world. He suggests that obstacles to linear passage defamiliarise space, and the experience of moving through such spaces creates an unfamiliar state. Whilst Edensaw emphasises walking, I argue the same defamiliarisation can be true running on ground that moves. And in saying this, I'm making reference here to the flint that's loose on the actual ground as I'm running in the films, and also the metaphorical ground that shifts when encountering a progressive disease like Parkinson's. And I'm also acknowledging the challenges for a Parkinson's sufferer in walking on level ground, because changes in the movement system of the brain of someone with Parkinson's leads to episodic gait disturbance, such as a thing called festination, whereby movement is one of chasing forwards as the ground underfoot appears to move, and also to freezing, a feeling of being stuck to the ground, particularly when crossing certain thresholds. Comparing the strategies of running, writing, and filming with an attempt at path making in both of the films, the concept of the path, as suggested by Martin Welton in his paper Getting Things Off the Ground, Pedestrian Feelings, supported movement between the terrain features that prevent locomotion, and drew parallels with Tim Ingold's observation of a story as a path traced through the terrain of lived experience. Characterised by doubt and uncertainty, making and travelling pathways became a metaphor for my encounter with the surfaces that epitomise the terrain features of my experience of Parkinson's disease. Images of a lighthouse in a flying centre of gravity and reference to a crossbuck in a well-trodden path act as further metaphors, alluding to strategies of avoidance as one approaches a situation of potential danger. Recurrent themes of avoidance and attempts at equilibrium occur in the texts that appear in both works. For example, in A Well-Trodden Path, the viewer reads, "It's more difficult to keep balance when the flint is partially buried. I try to jump over it, but it's everywhere. When she stumbles, she causes me to jolt, and I try hard to maintain my position." And in A Flying Centre of Gravity, the viewer reads, "She watches to see you fall without taking a step. You're frightened of falling in the fire, so you keep away from it, apparently forced to follow a flying centre of gravity." A similar yet seemingly failed attempt at equilibrium is inferred in A Well-Trodden Path, where two parallel paths, dissected by the split screen, rub against one another, disrupting any attempt at symmetry. This failed attempt is reinforced in A Flying Centre of Gravity, seen here, where two simultaneous yet opposing directions of travel are divided by the split screen. So we have the verticality of the forward motion of the running body on the left and the horizontal tracking of the landscape on the right. The text in each work, whilst attempting to act as a counterpoise to the images, invariably adds to the sense of imbalance. The split screen as a strategy of interruption creates a fissure in the image surface, a metaphorical threshold that divides and separates. The moving images collide to reflect a paradoxical situation of simultaneous proximity and distance, mirroring the relationship between mother-daughter and illness-health. The gap between the images is one that cannot be breached by illness and one that dare not be crossed. Running feet are in touch with their surroundings and leave a trail, and this is evident in the literal traces of footprints along the dirt path in a well-trodden path. In Ways of Walking, Ethnography and Practices on Foot, Tim Ingold and Lever Gunst refer to a narrative trail as revealed on the surface as a series of discontinuous marks or imprints rather than a continuous line. Michel de Certeau compares paths with words as referring to the absence of what has passed by. And according to John Berger, every step is a stride over something not said. Berger, like many writers, compares narrative writing to path-making, and whilst Ingold does this concerning the process of handwriting, he also stresses the particular nature of printed or typed text. Ingold describes the line of walking as a way of knowing, and the line of handwriting as a way of remembering, each integrating knowledge along a path of movement. However, he describes the process of both reading and writing typescript as a different process of laying out linguistic fragments to create a composition similar to the way a cartographer indicates the locations of objects. In this way, he says the reader surveys the page as if from a great height. In doing so, he occupies the page and asserts his mastery over it, but he does not inhabit it. Ingold denies movement in the printed text since the writer no longer lays a trail. Instead, he says, the line of print joining evenly spaced letters is like the record of gait analysis. The letter line of print or typescript does not go out for a walk. Indeed, it does not go out at all, but remains confined to its point of origin. So veering between methods of running, walking, and handwriting typescript, I drew on my tacit knowledge, developing a story to get closer to communicating my experiences of illness. Shifting the initial story to typescript from handwriting was a way of recording that sought to anchor yet navigate a way out. My aim was for the viewing subject's experience to be paradoxical, seemingly fragmented, confined to the spot by the text, whilst at the same time being led along by moving images, to create an impression of the simultaneous connection and disconnection and distance between two bodies. I was drawn to Rebecca Solnit when she writes in The Far Away Nearby about the distance between her and her mother, who had brain disease. And she writes, I was distant, I studied her, I pondered her. My survival depended on mapping her landscape and finding my roots out of it. I coped by retreating, and maybe I did become a mirror, a polished surface that shows nothing of what lies beneath. In both films, writing, along with filming, editing, and running, was one of the narrative tools I employed to develop my interrupted stories, drawing on Arthur Frank's autoethnographic approach, as described in The Wounded Storyteller, Body, Illness and Ethics, whereby forms of interrupted storytelling give a confusing or inconsistent quality, that is, the stories are uncomfortable. In autoethnography, Understanding Qualitative Research, Adam Jones and Ellis describe autoethnography as a way of starting a research project from experiences that turn us inside out, and suggest it can begin with thoughts, feelings, identities, and experience that make us uncertain, knocking our sense-making loops and making us question, reconsider, and reorder our understandings of ourselves, others, and our worlds. So I drew on a process of entangling memory, observation, and reflection, including at times reference to accounts of the regulated body experienced through medical intervention. I also adapted a method of listening out loud. Adam Jones and Ellis described this as a process which involves listening, telling, and retelling, So starting with a conversation to reveal aspects of the other's identity and experience, the conversations are not immediately transcribed. Instead, they're captured with the technology of the ear. Participants then retell what they understood of each other's stories in the first person. In the research for my films, this involved listening to my mother relating some of her memories, and then without recording, retelling them, initially capturing my recollections of her stories in handwriting, not only words spoken, but observations of the disjointed gaps in between conversation, the pauses, the repetitions, the gestures, and bodily movement. This storytelling method also draws on that of Della Pollock, which she suggests intends to incorporate others' memories into the body of our own, and then again into others' stories through reperformance. As Pollock observes, the I become in telling your story is one who doesn't and can't possibly, in any kind of full or total sense, know you, who learns the limits of representation. And I'm reminded again of Rebecca Solnit, who in Men Explain Things to Me and other essays, suggests that to write about a life, your own or your mother's, is to engage repeatedly with those patches of darkness, those places of unknowing. They tell us there are limits to knowledge. In the context of the moving image, the narrative in my films allude to what Blackie observes as moving beyond narrative, to draw attention to the contingent nature and inadequacy of verbal forms of communication and the effective excess that cannot be contained by them. Oscillating between first and third person, my narrative reflects on Blackie's analysis of third-person narratives as sites of mourning and remembering. There is a disjunction between image and text, which highlights the limitations of language in describing an experience of grief. And this is similar to the way that an artist such as Arit Asheri uses fragmented narrative in her video, Dying Under Your Eyes from 2019, which captures a sense of dislocation and disorientation experienced through her own grief. Asheri describes the work as a way of mediating her relationship with her dying father, and through the retelling of his stories, to spend longer with him. So, working with various writing methods which mirrored my film editing methods, including dissociative relationships with the writing, phrase manipulation, word substitution, cutting up, reassembling, etc. I drew on the partial, the sometimes chaotic, and the non-linear. I sought to highlight the impossibility of fixing my lived experience into a coherent narrative. And so whilst I refer to narrative, the sense of coherent meaning and linearity implied through the use of the term was defamiliarized. By combining reading with the moving image, I'm attempting to highlight an interrupted story and divert thinking in several directions at once. Constant digression through each text reinforces the idea that the stories are metaphors for the interruption experienced through illness. The push, pull, and break of the text, in combination with the looping nature of the films, alludes to the unknown order of illness and its enduring repetitive nature. A seeming lack of order and a lack of coherent beginning and end in the films emphasises unruliness and unease. I have spoken a little bit about the relationship of writing and running to my filmmaking process, but as you can see from some of the film stills, well, all the film stills probably, I'm also interested in the capacity of haptic images, which we've talked about today, to convey aspects of embodiment and enhance complex intersubjective engagement. And I also draw on Laura Marx's reference to the haptic as a feminist visual strategy, or as a form of tactile looking, which presents as a method that can be, as she says, called upon when our optical resources fail to see. And as Marx suggests, haptic visuality may fasten on its object, but it cannot pretend to fully know the thing seen. Instead, haptic visuality inspires an acute awareness that the thing seen evades vision. So in summary, the films I've discussed with you just now have been designed to work against interpretation in many ways. and to deny a straightforward narrative reading, to try and capture something that evades me. My emphasis on representing an interrupted narrative is suggestive of my experience, which is often difficult to rationalise and often beyond what I can communicate through language. Ultimately, my hope is that the work acts as a creative counter to orthodox ways of thinking about women's embodied experience of vulnerability and extends knowledge of experimental filmmaking, which foreground women's experience of illness as visual poems. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Janice. That was absolutely mind-blowing. Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Emma Flynn. Emma is a second-year PhD student at the University of Stratchclyde. Her thesis examines representations of sexual violence in contemporary English and French literature and film, exploring how the #MeToo movement offers both contextualizing and obscuring potentials in these texts. Her talk is titled Politics of Vulnerability in Contemporary Women's Writing in English and French, #MeToo, Text and the Tribune. Emma, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just share my screen. I'm extremely honoured to be closing out this conference. It's been an incredible 2 days of panels, just really rich and so much to think about as well. So thank you so much to the organisers and all the presenters. I think I've changed my title a little bit, but not too much. So Me Too, Text and the Tribune, Reading Vulnerability in Boy Parts by Eliza Clark and Dans le Jardin de l'Ogle by Leila Slimani. You might be able to hear, but I have a minor case of pleurisy at the moment. So if I have to stop and cough, I will mute myself, and I do apologise for that, but I'll try my best not to. So to give you a bit of context to how this comparison came about, as Pooja mentioned, my thesis looks at representations of sexual violence in English and French literature and film. I just finished the film section, or I'm finishing up the film section after about a year working on that. And as I'm coming into the literature section, I was looking at various texts. I think I might have said in my abstract that I was also going to look at the Josémine by Karim Thuil and This is Pleasure by Mary Gateskill, but that was a bit ambitious perhaps. So I'll be focusing in on these two texts today. But as I sort of pulled these texts out, I was struck by how remarkably similar both of them were. And as I said, I've just started the literature section of my thesis, so this is perhaps more of a primary exploration or comparison of these two texts, some general ideas with some preliminary conclusions. So I really do invite your ideas and thoughts at the end of this. And when I conclude, I think I'll briefly talk about what I see to be some of the similarities and differences between literature and film thus far. Even though I won't talk about film in this presentation, I do think it's an interesting overview, at least. Okay, so I call this paper Me Too, Text and the Tribune. The discussion will largely be divided along these lines with connections drawn between them, of course. So I'll start now with Me Too, mention why I think it's crucial to discussions of vulnerability, particularly gendered vulnerability. So we're all probably now quite familiar with Me Too, the hashtag moment really kicking off with Alyssa Milano's October 2017 tweet that you can see on the screen there. As you might know, or you might be aware, this is not the first time the term Me Too was used. The activist Tarana Burke had used it as early as 2006 in her advocacy work for women and girls. However, when we're thinking about the hashtag moment, I think we can really see it coalescing around this tweet as well as the trial of Harvey Weinstein. And I've called Me Too a moment here, and I want to briefly be clear on why I call it that. I think that's particularly important when we're talking about texts that relate to the Me Too moment. So I follow Karen Boyle's conceptualisation that because it's difficult to identify the core characteristics of Me Too, it's more accurate to consider it as a moment and a discourse rather than a movement. I think it's also important to note that Me Too, or what we think of as Me Too, is heavily influenced by what media discourses made of it. So the media responses and artistic responses themselves form a crucial part of what this moment was, who it centred and what stories it prioritised. And I think this particularly related to those who are already seen as vulnerable, white, middle-class, heterosexual women. So what does vulnerability have to do with Me Too beyond that? Of course, the fact that disclosures of Me Too frequently centred around sexual violence or men's violence against women, of course, engenders vulnerability, as we have the narration of experiences in which someone was made vulnerable through violence enacted against them. However, beyond this, I think there's a vulnerability that speaking out itself occurs, and Francesca referred to this actually, but a quote from Catherine Angel here. Me Too not only valorised women's speech, but risked making it a duty too, a mandatory display of one's feminist powers of self-realisation, one's determination to refuse shame, and one's strength in speaking back to indignity. It also gratified a salacious hunger for stories of women's abuse and humiliation, though it did so selectively. So Angel suggests then that mass disclosure, and importantly the pressure on women to disclose traumatic experiences, can engender a negative vulnerability. And actually just looking at the screen I have up now, I think it's really interesting to look at sort of Milano's imperative to speak out on the right and Angel's critique of this on the left. And speaking out, Tanya Cerisi similarly argues that the speaking out associated with Me Too points to, I quote, an experience that is fraught with vulnerability and risk. There is the potential response of disbelief and trivialisation. So to move on to thinking about the utility of my comparison between English and French, both in my thesis and indeed in this paper. So as a catalyst, when I was thinking about the responses to Me Too in France, I rely quite heavily on La Tribune. Many of you will be familiar now with this intervention, but to briefly describe it for those of you who aren't, it was an op-ed published in Le Monde in 2018, signed by 100 women active in French intellectual, cultural and artistic life. It functioned as something of an attack or a backlash against Me Too and equivalent hashtags like Balance ton port in France. Perhaps the most famous signatory, and the one mentioned here in pictured here, Kathleen Deneuve. I want to just actually briefly pause on the fact that it began to be referred to as a Tribune de Deneuve in some media outlets, suggestive of the fact, I think, that Me Too adjacent discourse often focuses on individual narratives and sort of hegemonic narratives frequently featuring celebrities. In the Anglo-American world, for example, this was Weinstein as a singularly evil monster, but here Deneuve is centred due to her fame, making this a story about her. So in the first panel in Consent yesterday, actually, I think someone had noted in Me Too adjacent texts, we often see marketing around specific scandalous stories and individuals. I think perhaps a similar dynamic is at play here. So to return to the content of the piece, it was a backlash, like I said, to the politics of Me Too and its public allegations that said victimised both women and men. And it was also a valorisation of liberté d'importuner, or the right to bother. I argue also that it speaks to the idea of French exceptionalism when it comes to sexual culture, and it's emblematic of what Christine Barr calls a desire to distance ourselves as French people from a Puritanism which is Protestant, Anglo-Saxon and feminist, and this plays notably well in intellectual milieus. So I've pulled out here some sections that I think are crucial when thinking about vulnerability and writing and cultural difference. These are my translations. I won't read them all out, but I'll focus instead on what they suggest. I think there's the idea that women should eschew an essentialised vulnerability, that even if bodies are able to be violated, indeed violated in a gendered way, the inner self need not be. Now, obviously, this does not take into consideration the way trauma functions at an internal level, but I do think it's an interesting evocation of the rape script. So this idea that we're not reducible to our bodies, I think, calls up Sharon Marcus's conceptualisation of sexual violence as a grammar. And if sexual violence is grammar for Marcus, that means it can be upset by verbal, physical and mental interventions. It can be subverted. I think there's a sense then in the Tribune that the Me Too moment, especially as existed in the Anglo-American world, has a problematic relationship to vulnerability and victimhood, that it overstates the prevalence of both in women. And I think there's links here to the critique of victim feminism that's circulated for decades. So on to the texts. As I mentioned, these are both sort of texts that I drew up as I was preparing texts for my thesis. As I noted, they were really similar despite being from different cultural and linguistic contexts. And there was really some remarkable similarities between both of them, making them really fruitful for comparison. I think you can even see in the covers on the right-hand side of the screen there that both focus on this head and movement with the face obfuscated. So Dans les jardins de l'Aure, I'll just refer to that as Jardin from here on out for ease, was published in French in 2014. That's coming 3 years before Milano's tweet. And written by Leila Slimani, Franco-Moroccan author, whereas Boy Parts comes 3 years after in 2020, written by Eliza Clark, who's an English author. So perhaps these can be seen as sort of interestingly bookending Me Too on either end or sort of surrounding it in some meaningful way. So both centre around women protagonists, with Jardin in third and boy parts in first person. Jardin follows Adele, a journalist who lives in Paris with her husband and young son, and pursues extramarital sex with numerous men, often strangers. Her husband finds out, moves the family to the country, fundamentally isolating her and surveying her every movement. Boy parts follows Irina, a 28-year-old, extremely beautiful narcissist artist from Newcastle, whose practice involves taking pictures of average-looking men in vulnerable positions, often naked, posed in a feminised manner. And on several occasions, she harms the men in order to photograph their injuries. So we'll talk through here what I'm going to sort of refer to with regards to the texts. I think both of these texts follow women who are difficult and morally ambiguous subjects. They're also subjects who embrace objection. I think this has got a really interesting relationship to vulnerability. Both are subject to the continuum of men's violences in numerous ways, and whose relationships with men and sexuality are difficult and frequently dangerous. And finally, who have complex relationships to their own vulnerability and are concerned with the way this genders them in a way that they reject, and who attempt to skew victimhood in numerous ways. So to start with the idea of objection, and if you're emetophobic, I would mute or look away now. But both women can be described to varying effects as subjects who embrace objection. This feeds into their gendering and their proximity to vulnerability. So the opening line of Boy Parts speaks to this truth. Irina says, "I'm sick in my mouth on the bus into work. I swallow it down. The sandwich I ate at the bus stop is still identifiable by taste and flavour." It's pretty graphic, as Kristeva describes the spasms and vomiting that protect. Here in Irina's vulnerable moment, she protects herself by refusing to succumb to the hangover that she's experiencing. And this seems a theme that continues throughout. She's consciously oppositional to appearing vulnerable. She swallows the sick. Vomiting, of course, is the breaking of boundaries, bringing that which is inside out, drawing attention to the subject which vomits and the object which it brings up. Adele frequently fantasises about scenarios of objection. A quote here from an occasion on which she desires men in a bar to have sex with her, and I have the quotes from Jardin in English just for ease, but that they would spit on her, that they would reach into her guts and rip them out. Again, there's a movement from the internal to the external here. The mix of bodily fluids, of spit, of organs reminds us of the boundaries and the margins of the body. So I find the engagement with the object particularly interesting when thinking about vulnerability. Objection draws clearly up questions of subjectivity, of what constitutes bodily experience, frequently discussed, particularly for women. And also thinking about the internal functions becoming external. I can't help but think of that line from the Tribune about inner freedom being inviolable. They sort of draw this distinct line about what happens to the external physical self and the internal self. And I think that's too distinct a line that's been drawn there, perhaps. It's too sharp a distinction. For Kristeva, objection is innately tied up with this part of us that we seek to exclude, and that is the mother. Indeed, in these texts, both women have fraught relationships with mothers and motherhood. So they are mutually highly critical of each other, with this shown to extend to childhood. So we see her here from Boy Parts. She told me once that a picture I drew of Galadriel looked like a Burns victim. I was like 12. She told me if I was naturally gifted, I'd be better at drawing. And then from Adele's mother, you were the kind of kid that grown-ups don't like. You're the wickedness in you even then. So I don't think there's any really need to pathologise here, but I think seems obvious that both are sort of beholden to their mother's negativities. There's a feeling that the mother-daughter relationship is especially painful. The mothers feel an entitlement to their daughters and their bodies. That Irina and Adele go to great lengths to destabilise this power through their own sexual practices. Of course, Adele herself is a mother, indeed one who describes her son Lucien as a burden, and this feeds into how her hypersexuality is depicted as especially deviant. I don't have enough time to discuss this fully today. I just want to acknowledge that complicated relationship with motherhood goes even further for Adele. To further reiterate some similarities between the two women, so between Irina and Adele, they both have really strong, fraught female friendships with one other woman. So Irina has Flo, her relentlessly blogging, relentlessly twee best friend who she has a brief fling with in university. The relationship's really intense. Flo blogs obsessively about her on Tumblr. Irina reads it. And as an example of the way Irina talks about her, she says, "She'll introduce me to someone, then I'll watch her get stiff and sad because she's now the ugly friend." Adele is Milena, who watches her son Lucien while she pursues sex with men. Adele actually sleeps with the great love of Lauren's life, Mathieu. And at the book's end, she expresses a similar cruelty to Lauren over Lauren's childlessness. She says, "People who don't have children just can't understand. I hope one day you learn that for yourself." So both women often utilise their friends for the practical functions they play in their lives, and ultimately express a form of cruelty towards them. And in fact, they really express the kind of real vulnerability or emotional candidness that's often demanded in sort of female friendships, which I think is really interesting. And finally, as a final similarity is the concept of weight. So both have obsessions with thinness, functions as a way for each to control their own bodies. Adele comments on her enjoyment in the feeling of hunger, of how thinness makes her body vulnerable to breaking, which she enjoys. For Irina, who's obsessed with aesthetics, fatness is contra to beauty. To strictly control their diet allows them the illusion of control. Both reject food as pleasure, denigrating the idea of indulgence when it comes to eating. Irina particularly sees fat as an innate moral wrong. She frequently comments on Flo's weight. She's a size 14, for example. So I think the fact that both of these women are morally ambiguous is particularly significant when it comes to thinking about Me Too and that sort of discourse and the types of victims and the types of narratives that were able to be believed when spoken about. There seems to be an imperative that survivors and women in general be morally flawless when speaking out about misogyny or men's violence or sexual violence and embody the traits of a good or ideal survivor. These books really reject that simplistic characterisation. So I'm going to move on to talk a bit about sex and the sexual violence of the novels where it exists. Both women seek out violent sex and frame this through the need to feel. There is a suggestion that other types of sex no longer satisfy and that they're looking for more. There's an interesting notion here that through making themselves vulnerable is where they derive pleasure, but they gain power by giving it up. Adele's counter is quoted above, so she wanted to feel it, she thought that she could take it after she requests a man to be violent with her during sex. Shades into something of a non-pleasurable violent encounter. So it's difficult, I think, to categorise this straightforwardly as sexual violence. And actually it's the ambiguity of this, the ambiguity of this encounter, and in particular, Adele's response to it is what I really want to draw up here. After the event, she notes that her vagina is just a shard of broken glass now, a maze of ridges and fissures, a thin layer of ice with frozen corpses floating beneath it. So although Adele asked for or requested the acts that take place, they leave her in pain and disturbed. I think here of Catherine Angel's assertion that consent is a problematic paradigm. It does not follow that all consensual sex is good sex. So here Adele has consented, but the bad sex, as Angel terms it, it doesn't have to be assault in order for it to be frightening, shame-inducing and upsetting. Irina's encounter can perhaps be more straightforwardly categorised as rape or attempted rape, although because she is under the influence when she's experienced it, she does have to piece it together. But she's at a party with her sort of friend, Will, and she's put to bed after a bad trip on ketamine. While she's immobile, Will attempts to rape her before giving up, seeming to survey his work, then panicked and rejects her. Her response is complex. Irina's response, she frequently invokes humour when thinking about how to approach the situation with them. She wonders, do I send him a text? Just checking, Will, did you and your useless dick half-heartedly try to rape me last night? Later, when she's trying to force him to give her his car keys by pretending her nana is ill, she recites the following monologue. And I hope you won't mind me reading this because I think it gives you a really good insight into Irina's voice. So she says, Will, I say, I put my hands on his shoulders, my fingernails biting into his skin. My nana is ill. And do you know how she got ill? Some cunt gave her loads of ketamine and tried to rape her. And now she's at death's door. From what my mum told me, this scumbag couldn't get it up, but he still tried to rape her. And just because she was on Ket doesn't mean she can't remember that someone tried to stick his flaccid little cock into her, okay? And wouldn't it be an absolute fucking shitter for him if she posted his pictures to her Instagram page with a warning to women everywhere to avoid this attempted rapist? I'd be shitting myself if I was him, because my nana has a lot of followers on Instagram. My breath is ragged. So I think beyond its humour and its characterisation function, it's really interesting because it sees Irina as once resilient but also vulnerable. So although she's essentially confronting her rapist, she's unable to actually name herself as a victim. She substitutes someone else in her place. She's alienating herself from that position as victim. She really rejects this idea of herself as victim in general. When Flo asks why she won't report it to the police, she responds that she can sort it out herself, asking her, do you remember when we watched I Spit in Your Grave? This intertextual reference allows us to situate Irina as a avenger, who does not allow her victimhood to make herself vulnerable and instead will choose to enact violent revenge. Intertextuality plays a really key role in boy parts. So Irina is obsessed with extreme films, often invoking them as a lens through which to work through moral issues. I've mentioned some of them on the screen here, and if you're being fortunate or unfortunate enough to see any of them, you'll know that they feature quite extreme graphic sexual violence. Irina's ambiguous relationship to feminist politics regarding sexual violence is further articulated when she comments upon watching Snowtown that she finds the rape scene hot as fuck. This further adds to her moral complexity, making her a non-idealised victim survivor. Both protagonists go to great lengths to position themselves as invulnerable, in the process rejecting the essentialist idea that it is vulnerability that makes a woman. Irina is violent towards men, often attacking and in fact murdering one of her photography subjects, who's a homeless young man, and she buries him, she obsesses over. However, her experience of both attempted rape at the hands of Will and grooming that she experiences by a teacher as a young girl highlight that she actually does remain vulnerable despite her attempts to reject this. Adele, in similar vein to Irina, sees herself as different from other women. In social occasions, she longs to join the men's groups. However, we do see her recognise her own vulnerability as a woman, and in a different way from Irina, she recognises her ability to be protected or to feel protected lies in her husband. So in the quote on the screen there, Adele is frightened, she wishes they were in bed with Richard. The doors and windows closed, he wouldn't let anyone hurt her, he would defend her. So she recognises that when walking at night, she is vulnerable as women, and that she can invoke sort of masculine or a man to protect her. So what I've tried to suggest thus far is that instances of sexual violence and the women's experiences as victim in the text are couched in a type of ambiguity, how their experiencing of these and the responses to them is not straightforwardly vulnerable. In this sense, we might think of them as natural allies to the discourse of the Tribune. The women certainly reject the idea that they're eternal victims, and just because they are women, and both certainly embrace the autonomous sexuality promoted by the 100 Women. In this sense, actually, the idea of a French exceptionalism might be called into question. The Anglo-Saxon of boy parts is clearly not a misandrist British Puritan. I don't think, though, these texts actually express these ideas that straightforwardly, and in fact, they articulate multiple, often competing discourses. Although the protagonists are somewhat anti-victimisation, the narratives themselves are heavily in conversation with and representative of misogyny and how the continuum of men's violences impact women's lives, rendering them vulnerable whether they reject this or not. And I use Liz Kelly's definition of the continuum of sexual violence here, which is on the screen. Throughout both texts, the women experience casual misogyny from strangers as well as friends, people in the workplace. Of particular note is Richard's treatment of Adele after he discovers her infidelity, moving her to the countryside, completely isolating her and preventing her from living an independent life. Irina deals with sexualised harassment in the workplace, frequently experiences sleaze from especially older men. So I don't think then that these can be categorised as, for example, straightforwardly post-feminist texts or texts that reject the victim discourse associated with Me Too. What they do is bring into focus questions of consent and desire. How both seek out consensual sex that might be harmful makes us think about just what desire entails and how often desire seeks beyond feminist politic. As Catherine Angel describes, thinking about these problematics is not anti-feminist, but it's essential to feminist sexual politics. Me Too has brought to the surface questions of consent, desire, and crucially vulnerability. The Tribune stoked my interest in comparing French and English texts around the Me Too moment, but I don't think it tells a full story about these cultural differences or the supposed cultural differences. These books pose crucial questions about women's experiences of violence and vulnerability that relate closely to those raised throughout the Me Too moment. What types of stories and what types of victim survivors do we hear from and believe? So I want to end by just briefly mentioning what I see as the relationship between literature and film in this respect thus far, per my own research. In my work on Me Too adjacent films, so films like Bombshell, The Assistant and Promising Young Woman, I frequently comment on the homogeneity of the protagonists, particularly in their race and class, and the types of narratives they inhabit. So in Me Too adjacent film, particularly the entertainment industry and the campus are really all the only sites of interrogation. And thus far in my dealings with literature, I've noticed a greater diversity of protagonists, not only in identity, but in the worlds they inhabit and their complex moral characters. As I carry on with this research, I wonder if this will continue to be reflected, if these supposed marked differences between French and Anglo-American cultures will continue to be blurred. And that is me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. That was very enlightening. I'd like to thank all the speakers for these wonderful talks. And now the floor is open for questions. So I invite the audience to please either unmute themselves and ask questions or post their questions in chat.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's a fantastic panel to close the conference with and to have all of these themes. And it might not be a fully formed question, but I'll come back to some of these ideas. I've got a question for Janice. As you were talking about walking and handwriting, and I saw on one of the stills, you had the text of my ankle. I nearly sort of sprained my ankle whilst walking and running. And I was thinking of sort of, the way that your wrist hurts when you do sort of handwriting. And I was just wondering, sort of drawing on all of that, what's the role of pain as a way of knowing, and how do you sort of use that in your practice?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I'd have to really think about what pain meant. I mean, I don't draw on physical pain at all. If I'm making reference to potential pain, then it's metaphorical. But no, I don't draw on physical pain. Everything is very imagined. I'm trying to kind of communicate something that's going on inside my head. I'm not trying to communicate something that is happening to me physically necessarily. And in fact, the funny thing about the film that you that you're referring to there, Well Trodden Path, which I didn't say, was actually a reflection on 3 different scenarios. It was me running, it was a conversation with my mom, and strangely, it was a conversation with a horse. Because I'd also ridden that track on a friend's horse, and there are hoof prints on there. And so I was kind of also trying to imagine my relationship with this horse. So I've kind of intertwined these 3 different texts. And that, I don't know why I did that. The conversation with the horse, I suppose, again, it's a kind of metaphorical tool, if you like, that implies something of the difficulty of trying to have a conversation with somebody else about something they're going through. And it was an attempt to sort of say something about that distance between. But no, I don't dwell on pain, physical pain at all. It's too in my head for it to manifest in anything really physical. It's more a poetic device than anything else. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Emma, please go ahead.
Yeah, a question for Francesca, because I think actually some of our papers had crossing over elements, particularly when it comes to the idea about speaking out and vulnerability. So what I was sort of wondering, and you sort of touched on this briefly, but I wondered whether Franca Rami expressed sort of any regret over that aspect of speaking out in the way that sort of made her vulnerable when the narrative was joined to her as self. I just wondered if you could talk a wee bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, she only stopped performing temporarily. She actually picked it up again during the 90s. So I think in terms of, I haven't read any interviews where she's expressed necessarily regret about acknowledging that it was her own story. But I think that there was clearly some element of, her story being diminished by that association as victim that kind of led her to kind of stop. But it's interesting that now she repicked it up during the 90s. And that was kind of following the change in the law in Italy, where it became a crime against the body as opposed to a crime against public morality. And it was almost like with the new generation, she made a point where she says, older people might recognize my story from the facts, but younger people don't. So it's almost like with the new generation, it's almost kind of, I guess, lessened that kind of any feelings of regret and made it so that she can now re-perform it in a sense.
Yeah, because I was kind of struck, I was thinking about the concept, like Jan Jordan's concept, the credibility conundrum, that idea that you become less credible if you remember a traumatic event or if you narrativise it. So yeah, just lots of things that I was thinking about with regards to both of our presentations there. So yeah, thank you for that. It's a really interesting answer on paper.
No, thank you. Yeah, same. I was like writing down all the notes from your presentation. Like, so interesting.
Thank you, Francesca. Shirley has a hand up. Shirley, please go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just stop being a bush now and actually be a person. So really great panel and great papers. And what I was thinking about through all three of them was, you know, the effort to find devices to try to convey what is extraordinarily difficult material. And there's a lot of emphasis across the board on the difficult starting point and the person who's trying to convey something and the devices that they use. I think Francesca talked about audience involvement at one point. So my question really to everybody is a little bit about reception, which is always very difficult, and you might not have a lot to say on it, but I was interested in that audience involvement and you know, so what exactly happened there? You know, what was the nature of that involvement, and how did the audience you know, respond to them to the monologues? And then with Janice, you were talking at one point about what you wanted the viewing audience to feel, and I wondered what response you've had from people. Actually, I loved hearing your narrative about how you were trying to embody the really difficult relationship that you have with your mum. I thought it was really powerful. And then also maybe it's a bit more difficult to answer that question with Emma, with the text you're looking at. But yeah, is there anything that you have to say about that in any order?
I could say, I mean, it's very difficult well, it's impossible to determine how a viewer or a reader is going to interpret something. And I've tried different things with the work. So it's been installed in a gallery as a large image, or a large projection. It's been seen in quite intimate spaces on smaller screens. It's been seen quite conventionally in film screenings. I had a really, really fantastic response. God, I wish I could remember the lady's name, but I can't. It was a conference on autoethnography. And she was a bit older than me, and her response to the film, to certain things, there's some text in there which I didn't show, that talks about shoes and annoying shoes that never used to fit properly and now they're too big, and just sort of like little observations that I've made as part of constructing the text. And her response was, oh my God, I totally feel that relationship, that difficult relationship that you've had with your mom as she's got older, and the way that you then see yourself in her and then have this fear of what's potentially coming, you know, what's inside you. So that was a really fantastic response. And I just showed the film. I didn't even do a presentation there. But to have someone come back and give that response, to have felt that relationship, was really powerful for me. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Maybe it depends on how it's seen. If you watch a conventional film, you are sucked into it. If the work's bigger, you get more of a sense of being sort of carried along and in that haptic environment. So that maybe can change the way that the viewers respond. But yeah, that was an example of a good response. So I take that one.
Yeah, with regards the reception of Franca Rame, I think it's kind of very different dependent whether audiences who saw it as a theatre production or audiences on television, because I guess with theatre, there's the idea that people are paying to see it, they've made a choice to see it. So they're kind of, it's that kind of, I guess, that almost confirmation bias kind of thing. You get the echo chamber where people that are listening to these kind of stories are already in a position where they're kind of more amenable to it. So the kind of reception that she's getting performing is probably, you know, women who have had similar experiences. In interviews, she says after she'd performed, they'd come to the back door and talk about their experience. So it was almost kind of, yeah, I guess kind of like a earlier version of kind of a Me Too in that sense, in that it was a catalyst for women to start talking more. Whereas I think with the television, obviously, like people weren't really getting a choice. They were tuning into their equivalent. I presume it's like the equivalent of like Strictly Come Dancing, that kind of mass viewership. So people having it forced upon them. So their involvement's going to be wildly different for every one woman who's like, this speaks to me. There's someone else who's saying, you're going against the morality of Italy. But like, actually, when I was looking at the newspaper coverage after, in her archive, there's a load of letters, clippings from newspapers where women have wrote in to talk about their experiences. So it did spark a conversation. So I think that the involvement was, I mean, it's definitely present. The way it's structured, the way she structures the performance is to encourage engagement. But I think it was really important, the television one, in that it really did spark like a big kind of debate and a big kind of, yeah, like I guess a proto Me Too in a way, that really helped like give something to the like sexual violence debate. But it's something that I would like to do more researching, because the reception of it isn't something I've done loads on, but definitely something to think about. Thank you.
That's really interesting.
I think I can say one thing maybe about the perception of reception of boy parts. Often, well, frequently the criticism of it basically was like, oh, it's like a female American Psycho, because the character is aesthetically obsessed and almost sociopathic and is a murderer, basically. But when I read, Eliza Clark in a couple of interviews was getting quite annoyed about this, and she says, I've never even read American Psycho, and I think she felt quite sort of annoyed or irritated by the fact that this book couldn't be taken on its own merits, and it could only be seen, and often this is the sort of issue that faces many women writers, that often they can only be seen in comparison to not even our male contemporaries, but something that came far long before. So I just think, I think for her, she was like, well, this is a narrative, singular narrative about a woman. It's extremely different from American Psycho's narrative. So yeah, I think that's something quite interesting when it comes to the criticism and reception of this text, at least.
Any other questions? I have a couple of very small questions if nobody else wants to go ahead now. So I have one question for Francesca, and I think this sort of takes off from Emma's question to you, and it's partly answered it. But I was wondering if there have been other performative texts or literary or written texts that sort of engage with the play you've been talking about. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this was in the 1980s. So in the intervening 2 decades, has there been a lot of conversation about it, or has there been, in some senses, a performative sort of reaction to it, or a response to it?
Honestly, like I'm not too sure myself. Like, it's not something I've been kind of studying this just in isolation a lot of the time, in context either with her other work or in like the sexual violence debate. So I would have to look into that. But what I do think though is because of the nature of it being a performance piece, it's obviously got that element of replicability inherent in it. So I will say that during this time between the 70s and the 90s, they were really famous like internationally. And the problem is within Italy is that a lot of the time their work was valued more abroad than it was at home. So the kind of attention that they got, like Dario Fo won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 90s, that was all international acclaim. So I think if I was to probably look outside the Italian context, I might find more examples of people engaging with the text, because it was kind of, it was valued more abroad, I think, especially in the UK actually. Whereas in Italy, it was kind of, their reputation kind of stunted, I think, a lot of the engagement that they could potentially have had.
Thank you. I have a small question for Janice as well. I'm sorry, I know really nothing at all about the kind of theory that you sort of presented in your talk. I was wondering if the theorists you're talking about also make a distinction between, not a distinction, let's say the interaction between the runner and their surroundings, in the sense of an urban versus a countryside setting. Is that something that sort of comes through in the way the act of running or the experience of running is sort of theorized?
Not necessarily in any of the people I'm talking about, although Tim Ingold and Lever Gunts do talk about the differences between walking through urban and rural landscapes. So not in terms of that theory, but there's quite a bit of discussion in the artistic community about those differences of working in urban and rural landscapes. I mean, this landscape is just outside my door, and it was literally where I was doing my training when I was running the marathon. And, you know, quite simply, I was spending so much time training for the marathon because I literally went from, you know, what do you do? Zero to 5K. I went from 0 to 26K. So I was out all the time. And, you know, I kind of thought, my God, you know, I need to be making work. I need to research. You know, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, what's going on with this running? And so many different thoughts came to mind, possibly because it was in a rural landscape. Maybe I wasn't as distracted as I would have been in an urban landscape, you know, because I could just run and run and run. There was no one else around. And so that enabled me to kind of guide my thinking in certain ways. So no, I mean, there's some interesting artists. Kai Sing Tan springs to mind. She talks about a non-logocentric running approach. Veronique Chance, who runs through both rural and urban landscapes. Caroline McCall, who uses the body, so she works with running and drawing, but she did a really interesting piece where she's running up the side of a building. So no, not in those theories, but obviously, yeah, I'm aware of that difference. And I've kind of thought, I'd quite like to work in urban landscapes, but I don't know why I would, because I don't live in one. I don't inhabit one anymore. And I'm quite interested in the idea of making my own path as well. I mean, obviously you can do that in an urban landscape, but it's quite marked here. You know, you're literally leaving footprints. You're following other people's footprints. You've got that sense of mark making on the path that you don't necessarily have in an urban landscape.
Yeah, and I suppose the act of running alone, I think most of your film is shot when you're running alone versus, you know, when it's a crowded place or it's a running track where a lot of people are running, right? We have a very different experience, I think.
Yes, I think running in an urban environment is different. I think you're more, and when I've done that, you're more self-conscious of who's around. Although the difference running in this kind of landscape is one of anxiety and fear, a heightened, you know, awareness of your own safety or lack of safety. Because I was running in some very kind of hidden away bits of the countryside, you know, down country roads where you wouldn't see a car or a person for miles. As soon as you did, you were kind of frozen. So I don't know if that sensibility has something to do with, well, it will have had the way I was thinking and the kind of things I was thinking about when I was running, which promoted the themes for the work. But yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody for presenting. And, you know, I mean, we have a long list of thank yous as well. And I'm just wondering if, whilst we're sort of going into the celebratory mood of the conference, but if anybody's got any other events or publications or call for papers or conferences that they would like to share, then please feel free to share, unmute yourself, put all the details in the chat so that we know when we can see each other again. I'm just going to do my thank yous if nobody minds. I'm sort of going into Oscar mode again, but I really want to sort of do all the thank yous because it's been fantastic, and I know that everybody's, you know, we sort of have marking at the back of our minds and other things, and it's just been such a fantastic 2 days to just talk and make notes. And I think I filled out so many pages of my notebook that I have to change it in a second because it's full of research notes. So thank you so much to everybody who's participated, all of the participants, all of the speakers, everybody who joined us in the talks. This wouldn't have happened without you, so thank you so much. Thank you so much also to the chairs, and I'm going to name them individually because they've done such a fantastic job. So thank you so much to Yuta, Sonia, Dominique, Douglas, Milena, and Pooja. Really, really grateful. Thank you to our fantastic keynote speakers, Dr. Helen Vassallo and Darina Al-Jundi, and Dr. Catherine Robson. Dr. Catherine Robson. Something was bound to go wrong by the end of this. And then thank you so much to Shirley and Godola for the support. And thank you so much to Jenny from IMLR and the CCWW. And last but not least, thank you to the John Coffin Memorial Fund because they were able to fund us to do this. And I'm just going to have a look on my list just to make sure that I haven't missed anybody. And I mean, I have missed somebody, but intentionally, thank you so much, Adina, because as we say, teamwork makes the dream work. And this has been long in the making. So thank you so much.
I want to repeat everything that Sandra said, because you don't need 2 Oscar speeches for the same award. But indeed, teamwork makes the dream work. But I do have to say the biggest thank you to Sandra, who's been absolutely my pillar this week. I was in the middle of oral exams. I'm exhausted. So thank you for organizing all the practical details and for keeping the technology alive. And thank you so much for doing this with me. And we just hope that we can work together again in the future. I hope it was a good experience for you as well, not just for me. And so I'm really, really happy to have organized this with you. And I'm really happy everything went so smoothly. And thanks to everyone for coming and for participating and for giving such fantastic papers. And last but not least, thank you for making this perhaps one of the very few conferences that have run on time. I'm very proud. I know it's something very odd to be proud of, but I'm really happy that we could make it without any technical difficulties and keeping our schedule. Thank you so much.